Somewhere along the way, we lost the root. For years, action, or at least the appearance or performance of it, on things like climate change, inclusion and equality, has shaped our political engagement, job choices, and for many, our identities. And it felt like we were headed in the right direction, and that the question was about speed rather than destination. Suddenly, this trajectory got interrupted. It turns out that a significant portion of our societies, and not just in America, do not feel that the future we envisioned is the one they signed up for. Or maybe it is that these groups have been led to believe that the cost of this future is a loss of their power, their position, and their values. Today, I'm not even sure what I mean by we. Lots of people are anxious and afraid and angry, and politics has increasingly become a competition over harnessing this anger. As this happens, the terrain is shifting beneath our feet. For business leaders, these changes are being felt as challenges to a long range of long-held assumptions, whether we're talking about the commercial sense of sustainability strategies, the acceptance that diversity is a precondition of innovation, or the expectation that investors and regulators would continue to push for net zero. Hi, everyone, and welcome to What the Fuck Now, a podcast by S7. Today's guest is Yves Daccord. Yves' career has taken him to places most of us will never go. As the former head of the International Red Cross, he's been on the ground in war zones, dealt with hostage situations, and sat across the table from heads of state and leaders of armed groups. He's also a journalist and has seen firsthand how societal and political sentiment gets made. We wanted to speak to Yves because that mix of frontline experience gives him a rare human lens on how the world is shifting and what it means for leadership today. Yves has spent much of his career driving progress on some of the biggest issues of our time, from action on climate change, democracy, and diversity inclusion, to the advancement of human rights and the fight against global inequality. As many of these agendas hit roadblocks, or even start to regress, we felt it was the right moment to get his take. Why is this happening? What are the root causes? How do we stay committed to making progress without underestimating just how hard it is to overturn entrenched systems of power? And most importantly, how do we regroup so more of us feel we're building a safer, saner future for all? This episode is a reminder that change takes time. And far from being an argument for giving up, it's a conversation about how to make that change real, lasting, and resilient by facing complexity head on instead of sidestepping it. Here comes Yves. Enjoy. Yves, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Rick. Very, very pleased to be with you all.
Since the Second World War, at least, we've been proceeding on a track, that's characterized by multilateral problem solving, globalization, global access to reasonably inexpensive goods and services, et cetera, crossing borders easily. And the implied hope, I guess, for many of us was that that would continue. And if we continued to work hard, diligently, and did the right things, global society would be reasonably successful working on some of the bigger challenges that we see out there, like poverty, like ecological degradation, war, which you've spent a lot of time looking at and working on over the years, violence, and human rights abuses. And here we are now, right? And many of us are wondering if we just got it wrong or what happened. So first question to you is, if you sort of take that zoom out approach, how do you see what's happening with the world order at this moment?
I'm really struggling, like everybody, about what's happening. And I think there are at least several options. One option, it could be that when you say that somewhat we were on a trajectory that was rather complex but interesting for a lot of us, in terms of global, let's say, global good, where we felt we were moving in the right directions with some problems, but still. I'm wondering if we are not just right now seeing the end of a parenthesis. And in a way, what happened, it was very much for us, let's say, post-industrial society from the Western world and some Asia, but the rest of the world have not at all seen that. and that we suddenly are back to where the other are. High level of uncertainty, high level of conflict and tensions and polarization. At least I'm wondering that somewhat that maybe what is happening is that we, the privileged West, if you look at that, seems suddenly less privileged and less back to a world order that has been experienced by a lot of people throughout the last decade, but where we were somewhat slightly a part of that. And that's one element. But most importantly, what strikes me though today is how much we are as a society experiencing vulnerability in a very different way. And I think this is what we are grappling. I think people feel much more vulnerable today than they even a few years ago. I think they feel vulnerable as an individual, but they also feel that their society is vulnerable when it comes to health, when it comes to education, when it comes to security. And that's what we are starting to see and hear. And at the same times, of course, what is new for us is the famous communication environment in which we all operate. You as an individual, you can choose which communication environment you want to be part of that. So all that together makes it a very polarized environment. And that's maybe what is difficult, makes it also an environment where time frame has shifted very short, constantly, for us as individual, but also for our collective response and globally also. The mix of all that makes it a very complex and very uncertain time.
I want to unpack that first piece a little bit because that's interesting. So what you're implying is that maybe the way the world is has been quite stable for a very long time. But then, that parenthetical, there was a period after World War II where it was different for some reason, almost like a Goldilocks period. And what's happening right now is rather than that Goldilocks period continuing, we're in a way returning to reality, global reality, which is tough. And secondly, interestingly, you said, and don't forget, most people on the planet didn't actually even really participate in that Goldilocks zone very much. They watched it from the outside.
Yeah.
Am I getting that right?
I would argue with, of course, we would have to unpack a little bit. I think what people have experienced, though, globally, is a certain form of capitalism. Absolutely. That is true everywhere.
Right.
So even if you would be on the most remote part of the planet, the most poor part, you've seen some of the elements of a world that is connected and a world where profit is very global. You've seen that. You would have seen that through, the way you would transmit money, for example, with your diaspora or your people away. You will see that through drug, for example, trafficking that is really around the world in the most amazing place, or weapons and somewhat consumption. And that's important. I don't underestimate that. But as a society, me as a citizen of a society in Africa, large part of Asia, and even some little part of Europe, if you're more on the peripheric side, not so much in the center. Yes, you absolutely you've not been part, let's say, of the world you just described at the beginning. You also have been not allowed and welcome, invited to be part of this world. Yeah. And you've been in a very tough place already for a lot of time, and uncertainty has been with you for a long time. So somewhat what I'm hearing also is it's good to see you guys all these lovely privileged people, and not just the elite, but somewhat this part of the world. It's great that you are also somewhat now encounter a lot of uncertainty. And that's also what I'm hearing sometimes when people vote. We are just wondering, why are they voting like that? It won't help them, really. But That's not what they're looking at. What they want is they want you, me, to feel, in fact, their anger, their uncertainty. So there is something about that is happening. And yes, it means that I'm always careful about, the repetition of history. But it's true, I found the world, let's say, rather in its own chaos, rather stable. So, and I think we should at least reflect about what is happening over the last kind of 50, 60, 70 years in the Western world, let's say mainly, and with some of the Asia, as a possible bubble, a little bit, and that we are suddenly back to something that is much more equal, somewhat, but also much more painful.
Interesting. So, in linking a little bit to some demonstrations of corporate leadership we're seeing at the moment too. I mean, the values and the beliefs that we saw espoused over the past 10 or 15 years ago when we moved into lots of activity around DEI, understanding the differences in different groups of people and creating space for them. All of these sorts of things was that just leaders faking it potentially, or what's your view on that? Like, did we mean all those things and now suddenly we don't mean them as much, or?
Oh, it's a very good question, Rick, and I hope we have 10 hours to unpack it. No, but let's do it in 2 minutes. I think the real diversity really hit hard at the beginning was a diversity that was based on a very pragmatic perspective. If I just look at my own organization, former organization, working in the humanitarian world, I think we were very white, somewhat, very Western, and we wanted to go and help the people there and really do that with a clear approach. But we realized kind of 15 years ago that we would not be welcome, not just by the warlord or the government, but by the people themselves. No, white men coming to help us, go away. We don't need you. So I think there was a very pragmatic kind of perspective. Oh, wow, okay, shit. So I still want to go in East Africa, for example, or in Afghanistan, but I possibly need to start to really be serious about the way I represent my own organization through culture, through people. So there was something, just to give you an example, I deeply believe that in a lot of business, the gender diversity has been understood very at the beginning, at least, as something that was essential to reach out consumer. You want to understand your consumer. You better have part of your consumer in your strategic thinking. You can't just have, as an example. So so this, I think the call for that kind of diversity, things for me very rooted into business, if I may say, and very concrete element. I think what we've lost over time is we've lost the fact that it takes a lot of time. And we're still living in a world that has been a world in most of the places where you had leaders that were looking like you and me, and they found difficult to somewhat recognize that they needed to give space to other entity within their own system. And that's, of course, is much more challenging if suddenly you have, much more women or people coming from different cultures starting to, in fact, being part of the organization, and then all the culture of the organization is shifting. And I think one thing in diversity people have always underestimated is how long it takes to change and to upgrade, if you want, a culture of an institution, as an example. How do you do that, or a society? So, but this move is there with us. What was much more difficult is over the last, I would say, maybe 5 or 10 years, was when some specific group of a society decided, rightly so on their side, also to make their voice heard. I think the key question for me is time. And I think this has changed dramatically. So that's why when we talked before about back of history, one big difference for me is the way we are experiencing time. I think we are at all our level, individual, and this is related not only but to social media, to our phone, to the way we have fragmented our own reality, right? Really on a daily basis. But it's very true at the level of society. I think that's something really I was struck by over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I would meet minister at the highest level, prime minister or president. Not all of them, but most of them, at least, let's say, they would be able somewhat to think a year and a half ahead, right? Not in all detail, but a bit of a sense. Today, maximum, but really kind of be 3 weeks. Wow. Maybe a month max, right? I think there is something about the way the time frame has really shortened. And it's very true also for, in fact, the gender diversity and in general, the diversity inclusions. I think there was an expectation that we would move from one world to another next day. Done, impossible. Right. Very impossible. Doing it smartly, and that's what is the complexity. It's the inclusion part that takes a lot of time. Look at our society. Our society is different. I don't know how it is about your kids. If I just have 3 daughters, if I just reflect about myself, I'm coming from a privileged society. I'm European, let's say from Switzerland. I do remember when I did my school years, most of the young guys with me at school, guys and girls, they were like me. Not the same background, but somewhat same color, same culture, same language, no questions. So diversity was very limited. Diversity was about our parents' background and are you Protestant, Catholic, but it's a very light diversity. One generation later, same country, my kids, they have a completely diverse culture around them. My daughter, 6 years old, fine, totally normal. No question for her. It takes a generation.
Yeah.
And we forgot that. We really forgot that. There's this pressure that everything needs to happen at the right time. And the fact that we force it as a collective, what happened is, of course, when you do that, you're losing the people who feel that they're not part of the conversation, as always, and they also want to be heard.
Interesting. We work with businesses and we work with business on culture. And one of the things that we try to impress upon folks is, the diversity part is relatively easy to accomplish. You do that through recruiting, right? If you don't put equal emphasis on making sure that you're including the diversity that you're bringing in teams and the way things operate, et cetera, in the short term, it's likely that you'll make things worse.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
And a lot of businesses, we work with a very large home furnishings brand who's been extremely clever on the first, and they've also been really good at identifying the second problem and starting to work on it, but it's tricky.
Can I just say something?
Yeah,
sorry, just because listening to you, it really remembered me. It was a study that was, I think, done kind of 30 years ago, but I still have it. It's a US study, 10,000 people, and they asked them, you have the choice. One choice is you get $5,000 and your neighbor gets 50,000. Other choice is 500 for you, your neighbor 500. Please choose. 84% go for option 2. Wow. Which means you're receiving 10 times less, but you prefer that because your neighbor is receiving the same. So what I'm saying is there is something in us as an individual with our brother and sister, but also us as a citizen with our neighbor and other. There is something that we don't want them to get much more than us. Really, it's okay as long as we all are somewhat okay, right? And we're living in a time where inequality between the people has created a lot of tensions, much more than we think, for some bad reason, but that's the case.
A quick break from the serious stuff. If you're enjoying the podcast, please give us a like, leave a review, or hit follow. It helps more people find What the Fuck Now, and it keeps our algorithm overlords happy. You alluded to it earlier when you said, when you have this sort of situation in society, then there are people that are going to want to play with that. There are people who see profit and influence and power for themselves by taking advantage of this. And you've previously zeroed in a bit on the word anger.
Yeah. I think one thing that is striking in a way is to see how much we've seen over time. And I'm coming also from a world, not only the humanitarian world or the war world, I've also, and diplomatic world, I've also, experienced let's say the media world for different reasons, at different moment in my life. And one thing, what strikes me over the recent time is how much you have I would say almost a professionalization of anger, right? So you do out there people that really understand how not just to answer and listen to anger, but also validate anger. Very important. You're angry and you're right to be angry. And I will be angry with you, right? That's very powerful as a message. That's very powerful. And I don't think we can understand the power of somebody like Trump, for example, without understanding that he has this ability. I would say he's almost a genius about, recognizing and validating the anger of the people, but he has an ecosystem around him that has professionalized anger, really. If you look at media, the most interesting media, interesting in a sense, the one who have expanded the most, are the one that really are somewhat professional about anger. One of the reasons is the podcast works so well is you can really express yourself. You can go for it. You can shout. You can, there is something about that. And podcasts with people who have very strong opinion, very aggressive, are welcome, and there are space to do that. And you see in a country like the US, I've really experienced almost competition between anger. The anger of some part of society who felt completely not recognized on the gender base, for example. And then the anger of the young white male feeling completely left out of the conversation. And you have this competing anger. And the one who can absorb this anger, the one who can validate this anger, is the one who really is able to then win over and define the agenda. And last but not least, it's interesting also to observe what has happening in Romania, for example, over the weekend. If you look at the way the candidate that is leading, the way it is really exactly about that. It's about how do you capture anger, and then based on that, is trying to define who is us. Who is us? And especially by explaining who is not us, right? So I think it's interesting. So it doesn't propose a political program anymore. It's not a political program, but there is a program of identity. And that's what the politicians today that are very powerful are the ones that are able to build on the anger and validate the anger of the people and propose an identity program. If you vote for me, it means you are with us, and us is a very special brand, and the other are not part of us. And the one are successful are doing that, yeah. Across the world, by the way, across the world, not just in the Western world, right? Across the world. In India, absolutely. In some part of Africa, also, you see that coming up, or in Asia also. So very interesting moment where you see that across the world.
Yeah, so there's a lot of rapid learning happening at the moment, right? Where these influential folks are looking at what Trump has accomplished and what others have too. I mean, one of the things that we want to talk about in this section is how the sort of liberal elite or the elite found themselves so far away from everybody else. And one of the reflections that I've had, and I've heard from many friends watching Trump over the past several months, is, how could somebody say that? How could somebody talk like that? How could somebody mean those things? That's so far from who we are. But what you're saying is, there are many folks that we maybe don't see or identify with who are very angry, who feel like they're losing influence, they're losing control, they're losing power over their own lives maybe. They're very angry, and they suddenly see somebody in a center of power who's speaking the way that they feel, and they love that.
Absolutely. And I think we should not just look at Trump. Trump is an interesting phenomenon, of course, a little bit extreme, let's talk about, but look at what works well in the world of today. I think people will tell you how much, for example, the evangelic churches, not just church, are successful around the world. One of the question is, because they are able to give back, I think, to people the sense of belonging. Yeah. I think one thing the elite has not understood, and really globally, from, by the way, to the right, from the left, I think, globally, they have not understood that seeing a global world and feeling some of the impact has made a lot of people completely left out of a sense of belonging. I'm part of this world. Yes, no. How does that work? And I think, and especially in corporate world, but also government, I think a lot of outsourcing of job, for example, economically makes a lot of sense, really. But in terms of belonging, makes it much more difficult. There's a lot of study that has been done, for example. You would say in low income job, you would be, I don't know, a security guard of a company, but you still feel, I'm at Ford, as an example. And I feel I'm a Ford employee, even if I'm security guard, it's okay, but this job has been outsourced. You're still doing security guard, but you don't do that anymore with Ford. It's a company that changed already 7 times the name. The wage have gone down. You don't know to whom do you belong. So I think there is really something about that. So I think one thing if the elite has lost is the ability to create an ecosystem or several ecosystems that would allow people to belong. If people don't belong, then they will have to go where there are spaces that will welcome them.
I think we often overlook how much business is mixed up in all this, right? And one of the other things that I used to do in a global program we ran around the world was periodically ask the participants to raise their hand if they were leading a business or operating in a community where they grew up. And you'd be shocked by how many hands would not go up. And then the second question would be something like, okay, so you've moved, that's fine, people move. How many of you sit on the school board in the community where you live today, or you are a scout master, or you are a et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And these were very, very, very influential people. You contributed to that program too. 2 levels below the CEO, making big decisions, lots of money, serving many, many, many customers, and relatively, at least at that time, relatively liberal, progressive businesses as well. None of them engaged locally, right? So that was an interesting phenomenon. We went so far toward optimizing for growth, being efficient, making decisions based on the dollar.
I think we'll come back to the world. There are some people who have reflected about that, but we will come soon to the world of meaningful redundancy. And we've seen that even in terms of crisis emergency. We've created systems that are, not all of them, but some of them are really lean. Look at the logistics system globally, for example, pretty impressive. Yeah, but wow, when there's a real crisis, it's bound to be difficult, right? Too big. And so I think we will have to come. And we are slightly doing that based on, or under the cover of security or defense or energy sovereignty. You'll start to build your own kind of system and your own redundancies. But I think as a human being, as a collective, if we think, we would have to rebuild some redundancies. And redundancies are also important if you want to move in the right way. And redundancies, it could also be the way you exactly do spend time with your local community. Where do you invest? That doesn't look great as a society or as a corporate, but maybe that's also one of the places where you need to invest, as an example. And there is really something that you will see, meaningful redundancy. Remember, it will come back to us.
I'll be looking for that, and I mean, while this new reality has been, discouraging or disheartening for many, it is in a way still a bit of an evolution. And we've been talking for years about how the limits to growth, I think, was written in 1972 or something like this, right? So having unlimited access to extremely cheap goods wherever you happen to be in the world at every moment maybe wasn't something to ever aspire to. So in a way, some of this like cathartic, unfortunately executed transformation, if you can call it transformation, that we're in at the moment will yield, ref your comment on redundancy, some things that probably need to be done anyway. And then hopefully over some period of years, we can find our sanity again as well.
First, in 10 years' time, that's my vision, I might be wrong, I think we will have moved out of a global world, really.
Interesting. Regional or local?
Most likely a regional world, let's put it that way. With, of course, global perspective and connections. I strongly believe that we won't be able to travel as we travel, the elite, for example. We'll see. But the key question for me would be the cyber. So you can't just look at the real world, but also what will happen in the virtual world. And most likely, we're also moving into a world that won't be anymore a virtual global world constantly, where you might have a very important virtual world that will be with S than worlds. I think China, for example, is already building its own virtual world. I think the US in a way, and I think the problem of the US, they think as US, we are the world. Remember, when you win the basketball NBA, you are called world champion, which I always love that. All right. What will be then interesting is, will it be then other spaces? Will it be a European spaces when it comes to also cyber and data, whatever? And most likely, yes. So what I'm saying is, in 10 years' time, I think we need to move out of the fantasy of, a bit of less Trump and less polarized and think will be good. No, I think it might be a rather different organization in a way, in the way we operate. And to add on also, I think the other element that will come to us will be, as you mentioned, somewhat nature. And again, I don't think globally, I don't think we'll be able to do that. But again, regionally, think about where you are in Norway. I'm today sitting in Switzerland. When it comes to water, for example, most likely in 10 years' time, you will also organize around big bassins, you call it in French, so around the big rivers and the sea, just to organize water. Because you will have to centralize organizing that. So what I'm saying is, in a world where the division and the way we will work, it will be slightly smaller, right? And it will also have an impact on corporate. I think if you think about corporate and if you think about some of your audiences, I would argue in 10 years' time, the way they will also look at energy, for example, will be very different than the way they're doing. But also the way they will also look at their own people and their own staff and partner. And most likely, the premium on identity, belonging, part of something that makes sense for the people will be more important than today. So which means if you have a company based in Sweden, Denmark, or Norway, possibly in the next 10 years, you'll have to think about how do you yourself develop your own energy ecosystem that makes sense for your goods, but also for your staff and partner. The one who have the better energy system will maybe be the one who attract people, and the expectation would be also that you understand Europe or maybe the Nordic, you do that already, but kind of this kind of things will play a bigger role. I have no questions about it.
What does this all mean for Europe? What can we expect here? Is this good for Europe, or is this all potentially really bad news?
We can have very different perspective about that. I think we have overall the European feel somewhat, and the tendency would say, oh my God, China is moving so fast, the US somewhat also. And it's related to the polarization. It's also related, let's say, to now we have to talk about the Trump administration 2.0 and the strategy that Trump's administration is following. I think over the next 5 years, it will reinforce Europe, surprisingly. And one of the main reasons, maybe there is two reasons. One of the main reasons is because it requires suddenly to have a collective endeavor when it comes to security and defense. Yeah. You feel and you understand that it won't be just you with your Norwegian soldier or Swiss with your Swiss soldier that will make it, right? You understand there is a need of collective, and that's really understood by the people. And this collective is most likely European. It's interesting. So suddenly back to what I mentioned before, belonging identity, you will have when it comes to defense and security, which is so important for each of us. I'm coming from a world where I've really seen feeling secure is a need that is so important. For us, we're so privileged. But when you go in a high insecurity country, the first need, human need, really, first one is feeling and being secure. Yeah. So we will experience that at European level. And of course, with the choice of the Trump administration, and I would say whatever happens after Trump's, if he continues, if there is no elections, or if there is a replacement, there is no way back. No, I don't think so at all when it comes to defense security. I don't think the American will say, okay, sorry, make a bit of a mistake, let's go back, NATO. Don't think so. So I think we will have, as an example, Europe government, elite, investment, but also people feeling deeply, and it's very rare, feeling somewhat to have a same psychological contract. So that will reinforce the notion of Europe. That's one. And it won't be perfect, but very powerful. B, I would argue, we're living in a world where if you look in times of crisis, in times of chaos, in times of a high level of uncertainty, surprisingly enough, you don't want everybody to have their own opinion. You want to have something very clear, very centralized. Over time, if you want to be able to absorb the crisis and the different crises, decentralization system with somewhat the same language are absolutely central. It's true for organizations, very true for also political entity. So I would argue with all the problems of Europe, and I'm not talking European Union, I'm talking Europe. So including UK, Norway, Switzerland, this entity will feel first more strongly together, and B, will be able to navigate much better, surprisingly, in the next 5 years. They will also benefit from the tensions in the other big system. One of the strengths of the American system was, in fact, most of its part are very independent. The research academic, very independent from the government, all that. Very true for the culture, very true from, the business, whatever. And now you have the Trump administration on a daily basis, changing, challenging, that surprisingly centralized. I don't think people see that, but it's centralized, in fact, the entire US ecosystem, which makes suddenly a country that is losing somewhat its ability to be very agile. So I think there is something happening in the US that will make their ability to shape the world much less prominent than today, no question. And China is more fragile than we think. And also one of the reasons is because their leaders have changed one rule that was so important. That was a rule that was put by Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping understood that to save and maintain a strong one-party policy, he needed to have a way that would allow within the party to have diversity of somewhat opinion, and of course clan, all that. And that has been changed by the actual leadership that will now remain in power, without any limits. And that is also creating, for me, over time, a huge liability. So Europe, most likely, that's my guess, in the very painful few years, no questions about that, But in 5 to 7 years, if we meet again in your amazingly successful podcast at the time, what we'll see is, Europe is doing rather well, surprisingly enough. And well is not just money and investment innovation, it's also belonging. And that will be one of the critical indicators.
Okay, time for a quick plug. What the Fuck Now is powered by S7. We're an Oslo-based advisory firm that helps senior leaders, usually at the C-suite or extended leadership level, make sense of big shifts in geopolitics, climate, and society. Then we help them do something about it. For years, we've been sitting with clients, usually behind closed doors, trying to help them cut through the noise, challenge their assumptions, and see the world more clearly. This podcast is our attempt to open up that conversation to you too. If that sounds like your kind of thing, follow us on LinkedIn. So now getting a little bit to the punchline, we've chosen either intelligently or very unintelligently. What the Fuck Now is the name for this podcast, right? So, thinking about European business leaders, folks who are observing and listening to a lot of the dynamics that you just laid out, and thinking about what they do with their organizations over the next 6, 12, 18 months. What would some advice be that you would give to them? And, let's let ourselves too be a little bit inspired by the work that you're doing with our common home, trying to understand influence, et cetera, in societies.
So what we try to do is try to understand and go beyond dogma when it comes, for example, to climate change. And we realize that there will be nothing happening if there is not a minimum of societal consensus for climate transition. And if you want a minimum of societal consensus, you need then to reach out to the people, to the part of society that is left out or feel left out of the conversation. And most likely these people are really not you and not part of your own community and own tribe, if I may say. But in that case, might be people with more conservative perspective around the world. And you need not only to reach out, but you need to find them where they are. And that's the biggie. Don't, and we're very careful about, don't just do, I'm changing a little bit the pitch and I'm organizing, but I still have the same message. No, let's find them where they are and how they relate, for example, to nature and to climate, all that. And allow them somewhat to, do their own journey when it comes to that. And their journey doesn't please you, maybe. Yeah, it's okay. It's fine. I think it's important. So personally, my 2 or 3 advice is still in the ideal, and I've learned that from crisis. When you have a massive crisis, it happens. I had to deal with a lot of hostage crises in my life, sadly. And what we were doing is after 48 hours after the crisis started, we decided to always split the leadership. So we said to number 1, okay, do you want to follow the hostage crisis? Yes, no. If he says or she says yes, then that's your focus only. The rest of the business is taken by somebody else, right?
Okay.
And if I would apply that now, because we are right now objectively in a world in crisis, I would also explicitly in my organization, even if it's a small organization, task, myself as a CEO and maybe some of my C people or whatever to take care of the business and it needs, but also to create the space to develop mid to long-term scenario and perspective. And not just once and that's it for the next 3 years, but to have in the group people and spaces where we can discuss, okay, what's happening out there? What are the 3 or 4 elements? What are the key selected trends? And what does that mean for us? So that's one. B, I would select few elements that whatever your business will be very central. One, really, and there's several, but one very clearly is everything related to energy. I really think the energy sector will change dramatically. So we're back to a world where all the global connections when it comes to energy will be challenged. Most likely it means we'll have to rethink about bringing energy production, grids, whatever, closer to us, on the land, closer to our business. So what does it mean for my business? I would really reflect also about everything that is linked to cyber. And I would not just talk about cybersecurity, but I would really reflect about how do I want our collective to own the cyber, really. I think most of the organization are not exactly sure how to do that. And I think there is something about thinking not just me and my organization, my website and my cybersecurity, but also my partner, the people I'm working with, the people that, there is something about that where I think there is a culture to create, a cyber culture that might be over time interesting to reflect upon. And last but not least, I think the generation are changing, and I would take care of course, my entire team. But I would particularly look at two parts of my team. One is the older one, the elder people. I think there are change in terms of generation, the speed, and also the worry right now to become, older. What does that mean? But also the younger part of the generation. If I'm sitting with people, women or men, from Asia, Africa, Oceania, with let's say somewhat the same cultural background, and you find a lot of them, I find myself rather close from them and understanding the world, whatever. You bring in, kind of under 30-year people from my own society, they really think the world differently, and they experience it differently, and they express themselves differently. We know that, but I think so. If that's the case, I would find a way, and not just one person, but to bring them more into the decision-making and reflection. I would really insist on having young. I would really go under the 30, even under 25. There's something happening there.
Sure.
As always, in every generation, in the way they relate to the world of today, the way they experience also diversity, but also cyber, for example, and belonging. That if I would be a corporate leader right now, I would really spend time to understand what's happening, and to understand there's nothing better than having closely related to you.
Yeah, exactly. And thinking about your comment about your daughters, right? At some point, the pendulum is going to swing from those that we hear a lot about now, who are from the baby boomer generation or whatever you'd like to call it, to the new. And it's really interesting to wonder, like, what's that world going to look like? So I have hopes for those people. I assume you have hopes for your daughter and your daughters in their generation.
I do. And at the same time, depend a little bit what happens to them. If there is no space for them or not enough space, we will hear them loud.
We will, very loudly.
And most likely the next populist, for example, movement, I might be wrong, but might come really from that generation. And it will come around two issues, you'll see. One, no surprise, will be around, let's say, social solidarity. It won't be about nature. It would be about, okay, you've done an amazing work to protect yourself. You have an amazing retirement plan and compensation plan, all that. We're moving in a place where there will be no penny for us, not $1. Right. So what do you plan? What the fuck? And so huge solidarity issue. So I think, for example, they will push hard to have pension being, changed, reduced, which is totally taboo today. You would not touch that, as an example, very rarely. So, and the other one, I think, will still be around social media and cyber. I wouldn't at all be surprised to see a populist movement, but very aggressive, saying, government should be reinforced and used only if, not just for defense, but to regulate, aggressively, in fact, social media and data, because it's killing us. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see, really populist proposing we forbid any telephone, any social media, until, I don't know, at least in school, until as we've seen in Australia, but much more. So these kind of things will come. And I wouldn't be surprised that it's the younger generation, because they would say, we've been fucked by that.
So if you think the last several months or few years have been interesting, just wait and see what happens next. Yeah. Yves, thank you so much for taking the time today and for sharing your reflections. It's always interesting, and it would be fun to check in in a few years and see what happens.
We should. Rick, thank you so much. All the best.
You've been listening to What the Fuck Now, hosted by Rick Wheatley and produced by the S7 team. We love that you've listened, but we'd love even more to hear what you think. If you've got feedback or ideas for guests or topics we should tackle, we're all ears. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.